Great. So welcome, everybody, and it is my privilege and pleasure to formally welcome Irene Stern Frielich to today's session in our Hebrew College MaTaRoT workshops as part of our series on storytelling and the power of stories and who gets to tell stories, and giving us all tips and tools and ideas for bringing stories and storytelling to our students. And give me half a second because I am not seeing my bio of Irene. Okay, I think I have it now. So as I was saying, I'm really pleased to welcome Irene this morning. More important, I think, than anything else is how Irene and I got to be here today. Irene is a longstanding member of Temple Israel in Sharon and parent to two wonderful people who you'll hear more about one of them during today's presentation. And I've had the privilege of knowing Irene since our children were in daycare together many years ago. But so Irene Stern Frielich is the owner and president of Envision Performance Solutions, an award-winning instructional design consulting firm. She and her team have provided clients with customized solutions for 25 years, developing instructor-led e-learning courses on a wide array of topics, and they use storytelling for education in the corporate setting. So there's a lot that connects Irene to this topic even before her own personal journey. She has an MBA from Babson and an undergraduate degree in economics from Brandeis, so she also has that connection to many of us here. And she's also more recently taking many creative nonfiction writing courses through Grub Street in Boston. And I'm sure if any of you are interested in that avenue of growth, I'm sure she'll be happy to share. Her journey to writing her father's story began in 2016, following the presidential election. As anti-Semitic and racist hate crimes increased across the United States, she felt compelled to better understand the events her father lived through in Germany and Holland as a young Jewish boy in the 30s and 40s. So she traveled to both Germany, where her father was born, and Holland, where he escaped to and hid during the Holocaust. Irene's memoir, Shattered Stars, Healing Hearts, Unraveling My Father's Holocaust Survival Story, came out in October 23 and has earned #1 new release in Jewish biography and #1 new release in Holocaust biography on Amazon. Irene has spoken internationally about her family's stories and has had her articles published about her family published in the German and Dutch media. I hope that that formal bio gives you some real flavor and seduction almost to what Irene will be presenting to us this morning. I've also been privileged to have been present both on Zoom and in person when Irene has done variations on this talk. And I can also say that I read the book, and it is a very powerful adventure that Irene is going to take us on right now. So welcome, everyone, and welcome, Yafit. Didn't see you before. Hi. And Irene, take it away.
Thank you so much, Marian. It's a pleasure to be here. So first of all, I love doing anything with Hebrew College because that is where my husband and I met many decades ago. Well, just a couple of decades ago, I guess, in Brookline. And my two boys went to Hebrew College. So I feel an affinity also to Hebrew College, as well as all the other connections that Marian listed. So today's going to be a little different. It's not my typical presentation about my family's story. It's not an interview. This is a mini workshop about storytelling and story writing, specifically using excerpts from my book about how I even came up with some of these things. So I want to start by saying, as we know from our Jewish tradition and from many other traditions, stories are a powerful way to transmit the essence of our experiences. What we wish the learner or the reader, the listener, I always say learner, but the listener or the reader to take away, to act on, or to think about. And stories are also a way of creating meaning for ourselves and also for those who listen to or read our stories. And of course, our stories are influenced by the stories we inherited. Now, it wasn't until I understood that, something that I could only do after researching and writing quite a bit, that I could let go of some of the burdens I carried. Without, while writing about these stories, those burdens helped me to name them, to understand them, and to begin healing from them. Now, my goal for today is to give you at least three idea generators to help you write your own stories or to prompt others to write theirs by offering you different ways of thinking about your own story. And I'll do this using examples from my book. So just a little background. First, let me ask, how many of you did read the book, just so I know how much background to provide before we get into this? Just raise your hand if you've read the book. Okay, good to know. So the background I'll give then is, my father was a Holocaust survivor, and he died in 1994, quite a while ago. And with him, all the secrets that he never shared with me about his wartime experiences, things that I never asked him, that he never told me. And decades after he died, I pulled out the testimony video that he had made, along with photos and other documents of his that I'd kept. And as Marian mentioned, with the increase in acts of hate in our own country, I needed to understand my father's experience during the Holocaust. I ended up visiting his native Germany as well as Holland 3 times. That's a little crazy, I know, but 3 times within a year, from 2018 to 2019. And I was able to physically retrace my father's footsteps, his home, the German-Dutch border crossing spot, his attic hiding place where he'd lived for 2.5 years among the fleas and mice in the dark, with a radio where he could listen to the news about the Stalingrad battle and about the death camps. I gained a deeper appreciation of my father's story as I researched the history and visited the places. And I ended up writing my memoir. But the story I wrote, while it was my story, I could only tell it by also telling my family's story. So today I'd like to share with you a few examples of how a story from the past intertwined with my story, with my personal story, and how telling my family's story is also telling my story. So it goes both ways. Each story informs the other. And also how telling these stories helps us make sense of our history and ourselves. So I'm going to start with a slightly hot topic called Aryanization and reconciliation. So through my research, I learned that my family's home and business was Aryanized by a neighbor. And Aryanized basically means that the Nazis and the German people would take over a Jewish-owned store or home, either by force, basically for free. They just lived in it, or for a very reduced price. So I call this neighbor Weber in my book, and I located a couple of documents among my father's papers, as well as hundreds of related documents that I found in the Munster archives that paint a story. Now, I could have listed all the facts that I found, but who would want to read that? Instead, I used my imagination to bring the facts that I knew to life, and also to fill in the blanks that I needed to fill in. So I'd like to do a little activity, and I'm just going to paste something into chat. What I'd like to do is read you an excerpt from the book from chapter 21, Aryanized. And I'm going to ask you, as I'm reading it, to think about what brings the story to life for you, what helps paint the scene for you, and just type that into the chat. And I've listed the characters that I'll be talking about right here on the slide, so you can see who they are, and I don't have to spend time explaining all of them. So is everybody ready to do that, to listen and type in chat what brings the story to life? Cool. Here we go. 30 November 1938. Ernst Weber, a tall man with blonde hair, arrives in Gendringen at Selma's request. They have been longtime neighbors and colleagues, and were in a similar business selling clothing. Ernst holds his tall frame erect as he climbs the steps to the front door of the Brinkenborg home. He enters the home. His shoulders relax for a moment as he breathes in the pleasant aroma of the freshly brewed coffee and cooling apple cake. Ernst stirs sugar into the cup of coffee with shaking hands, causing the spoon to collide loudly with the sides of the cup. He anticipates new requests MaTaRoT might make as they would conclude sale negotiations on the Geburtsstrasse home and business. MaTaRoT sits across from Ernst, too agitated to take a bite of his apple cake, his indigestion again flaring up. He leads the negotiations on behalf of the property heirs, his wife Hilda and his brother-in-law Kurt, who sit nearby. We can no longer live in Bocholt or in Germany, MaTaRoT says. Instead of leasing the shop to you as our parents had agreed to a few months ago, we will sell it to you. We will sell you the entire building. Ernst's mind races. He is eager for this, to purchase the entire business and integrate it with his own. And he is prepared with a sale price that would be practical, fair to him, if not to the seller. Ernst has mixed feelings about his role in the inevitable. 30,000 Reichsmark, Ernst says a little too loudly. 9, that is far below the value. You know it's worth at least 4 times that amount. A plate drops in the kitchen, shattering, heightening their collective agitation. I can't afford that. Remember, the mortgage must be paid off and I need to replace all the windows and clean the inside of the store, the glasses and all the clothing and everything still. Look around, MaTaRoT says, somewhat louder, on the edge of defiance, as he motions to his wife and brother-in-law. We have no life in Germany. Hilda straightens herself in her seat, stretching her spine, slightly pushing out her lower lip. It's a look MaTaRoT immediately recognized as an expression of distaste. Ernst observes the body language too. I can go up to 30,070 Reichsmark, he counters. Ernst stares into his plate at the crumbs he left behind, at the piece of apple he could still scoop up to enjoy if he had the stomach for it. So my question is, what brings this story to life for you? And you can still type that in the chat or unmute yourself and feel free to say it aloud.
The pleasant aroma of the coffee and apple cake in juxtaposition with the shattered plate from the kitchen.
Great. So we have smells and sounds. MaTaRoT just typed exactly that in there. The physical details, the senses, right? You get the smell, the sound, that you can kind of see some of the things. The description of Weber, you can see what's on the table, where people are sitting. Good. Okay, so you get that there's a lot about this, the sensory experience here, and Ernst seems conflicted. So not only is there agitation in the room between the parties, among the parties, but also within Ernst himself, he seems to be a little conflicted. So I make it clear in the book, this is an imagined scene, but where did I conjure all this from? I didn't have these details. I didn't know the feelings. I based it largely on what I did know. But what I imagined was this. The look of Ernst, he's a tall blonde man. He looks like his grandson, whom I actually met. Oma, my grandmother, she acts the way I remembered her, with her lip when she wasn't happy with something I said or did. And I chose to make Weber somewhat sympathetic. I actually chose to make him somewhat sympathetic. I could have made him a total jerk because it was inevitable. He was going to get that store in business. He probably didn't have to pay anything for it. It would have been his. But I needed to write my own story. And for that, I leveraged my own experience. And what do I mean by that? So I had briefly met Ernst's grandson, Marcus, during my first visit to my family's former store in Germany, which Marcus now owns and where he lives, believe it or not. So it's still in the family. I eventually explained to him that my family had lived at his address, and I offered to show him photos of the building from those times on my next visit. He was very interested. So on my second trip, just a few months later, we arranged to meet again. Now, at that point, I knew that his grandfather had Aryanized my family's home and business, but I didn't yet know the details. I hadn't yet been to the Munster archives to find these hundreds of documents. So now I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 47, Healing Hearts, Can There Be Reconciliation? And what I'm going to ask you to think about this time is on the slide, but also in the chat. I'd like you to think about, what did I use from my current day experience to tell the story of a meeting that happened almost 90 years ago involving my ancestors? And it might be a little more subtle, but see if you can see what actually happened to me that I used in telling my father's story. So here are the excerpts. We walked the short distance to the Brücken Cafe and sat in a comfortable corner at a wooden table. Gemütlich, I remembered my mother calling it, the feeling of being tucked away, cozy. We placed our drink orders. I provided some context for Marcus. Our drinks arrived, cappuccinos for Josh and me, with a spice cookie on the side, and espresso for Marcus. We thanked the server. My pounding heart reminded me there wasn't much time. I mustered my rehearsed line. You told me you were interested in photos of what your place looked like in the 1920s. I have them here. Would you like to see some of them? That would be nice, he said. I handed Marcus the photos I had curated from my father's collection. 3 black and white images of my family's 1927 store on the top. Marcus pulled out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. It's dark in here. I want to get a better look at the details in this photo. I struggled to calm myself, to allow the moments that strung together to evolve, to sit silently for a while. The cappuccino machine in the background released its steam. I hadn't asked Marcus to look at the other photos that were underneath the top 3 that showed what his store once looked like. But as he did, I revealed a sliver of my father's story. As darkness fell outside, the low cafe lights gave away the glistening in Marcus's eyes. He looked at photos and patiently, intently, listened to selections of my family's escape and survival story. Marcus shared a small part of his own family's story. My grandfather was injured in the East. I was not sure which grandfather he was talking about. He was hospitalized for months. I have some letters he wrote home, but I haven't been able to look at them. It is too difficult. We both teared up. This was not a meeting of discord. It was a start of reconciliation, though I didn't have that word for how I felt in that moment. I fidgeted with my cookie. Marcus hadn't yet come to terms with his own family's suffering either. This surprised me. I was beginning to understand that the other side, the enemy in my mind, might also have inherited trauma. Non-Jewish German people had also suffered greatly during the war. This realization splintered my reality and opened a perspective that would give momentum to my healing. I'd never been permitted to think that way. We, my family, the Jewish people, we were the victims. So the question is, what did I leverage from that actual experience that I had back in the story of my family from 90 years ago? And again, feel free to put it in chat or to type it or to unmute yourself and say it out loud. So there was a tension. It was a different kind of tension, but there definitely was also a tension. And I address it by saying, I struggled to calm myself. A sense of compassion for shared victimhood. And that can kind of relate to what Ernst Weber was feeling, perhaps. He felt conflicted. So he felt bad, maybe. I don't know. I try to present it that way. Horrible events are horrible in different ways for lots of people. And what about some of the sensory pieces to my story did I use, do you think, reflected back to my family story. These were the subtleties. The coffee motif, yes. So when I was struggling with how to write my family story from 1938, I really didn't know what to write. And this meeting with the current day Weber made me realize I can just leverage these things. The coffee, the smell of the coffee. There was a cookie on my plate. I couldn't eat the last cookie, just like his grandfather couldn't eat his last piece of apple cake. This attempt to connect, right? I wanted to connect for some reason with this Weber. I don't know why, although maybe I did know why. Maybe it was to find some healing, which I did. There's a question, why was I so nervous, Wakey? That's a good question. I was probably the most nervous I've ever been in my entire life, meeting him for the first time. And then the second time as well, because I just wanted to connect with this person and I wasn't sure who he was, what he thought about us as Jews, or what he knew about his history. And I was very careful not to share too much with him. Yeah, he was also probably nervous that I might want something from him. And I tried to be very clear without saying it that that was not my interest. But I was nervous for me. I was also walking into this space that my father and grandmother would never go back to. They were so angry that obviously that this had been taken from them. I think also my nervousness was about my father and grandmother from somewhere up there, knowing what I was doing and not being happy with me about it. But my point in sharing these two stories is, and perhaps it was more subtle than I realized, but is that there were these things that happened in my current day experience that helped me to write and imagine the past day scene. And one of the other examples is the coffee machine letting off its steam. If you've ever been in a coffee shop where that cappuccino espresso machine does that, and it's really loud sometimes, that's what I heard when I was in that coffee shop. And so I related that or translated that to a plate breaking and shattering as a way to show the tension as well. So what I would love to do is have you take a moment to think about, we're not going to actually go into writing this all out, but maybe just in your own notes, think about an inherited negative feeling that you have about an event, a person, a place, an activity, something that you don't like to do and you suspect it comes from something you inherited. Just write about it for yourself. You don't need to put it in chat. In 1 or 2 sentences, what is the feeling? Where did it come from? And then what happened to cause this feeling? And I'll give 2 minutes for you to think about that and write something. take about 20 seconds to finish your thoughts. All right, so I just want to do a quick debrief for anybody who's interested in sharing. How was that process for you? You don't have to share what you wrote, but did you find it helpful? Does it make you want to go write more about something? How was that experience? And if anybody is speaking, we can't hear you, so you're muted.
Yeah, Jerry, did I see? Yeah, Jerry, please go.
So I mean, I think that at least for myself, I carry, like, I don't know if it's personal trauma or generational trauma or defining stories. And so the prompt brought up ideas around, I mean, for me, it was scarcity. I was raised by first generation Americans who struggled during the Depression. My father had some professional ups and downs. And while ultimately he had professional success, there was a time when the quote unquote joke in our family was, how long are we eating until? And so I think that's been a pretty significant imprint on my life and sense of both having enough and by extension being enough.
Fascinating. And so hold on to that thought. We're going to do one more very quick activity in a minute. If you're interested in writing more about that and exploring that, even if it's just for yourself, we're going to write a prompt for you to do that in a minute. We'll take one more comment before we move on to that prompt. Wakey.
Wacky, go ahead.
So as I
Wacky.
was thinking about it, I realized there are a lot of things that I have put on my grandparents' memory as if they had sent it to me. But I think when I really investigate, it's things, oh, my grandfather said this. Well, maybe he really didn't even do that. Maybe as I grew up and became more mature, more educated, put my feelings back on them as if they had told me. I don't know, it was very confusing.
Yeah, right. And that's a really good point. And that's the topic. That's the title of this topic. Is it their story? Is it our story? Really what I found was this great intertwining of stories, because one informs the other and it goes both ways, right? You're informing what you think their story was. So that's fascinating that you came to that. Yes. Good. Was there one other person who started speaking that wants to share before we move on? Okay, and then one comment in the chat was, it was hard, it's stressful. Yeah, it is stressful. And yeah, so if you're finding any tension in writing whatever you wrote or thinking about whatever you were thinking about, it probably is worth exploring and writing some more. So since we're going to move on to another topic, I have one more quick activity for you to do, which is on the slide number 3, which is to write a prompt in your own notes to help you start that story about an inherited whatever the negative feeling is that you were writing about, or negative activity or whatever. Just write yourself a question that will get you to continue writing, since we're moving on to the next topic. I'll give you a few seconds, half a minute to do that. Okay, so, I have to share that I never liked journaling. I never liked it, never liked really writing, to be honest with you. However, this process of writing this story, which was not just one, incident, but so many incidents over 360 pages, really had such an impact on me because even though I didn't even include a lot of what I wrote, the act of writing helped me understand some things and even heal from some things. So now I'm a believer in the value of journaling. Some of you probably already journal, so that's great. I admire that you've been doing that. So let's move on to the next topic, which is called objects as symbols and characters. So I'd like to ask you to think about, how does an object become a symbol? And can an object be a character in our stories? So I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 40 called The Button. In the midst of my research, I attended a Passover Seder at the home of friends in New Jersey. This ritual feast marks the beginning of the Jewish holiday and brings with it many traditions and long revered practices, which Jewish people all over the world enact to celebrate our ancestors' liberation after years of slavery in Egypt. Our hosts didn't verbally ask the question, but it was written on my place card. If you could add something to the Seder plate, what would it be and why? I could think of nothing because I'm a Seder plate purist, and I don't believe in altering or adding to this particular ancient rabbinic tradition. In that moment, I hoped I wouldn't be called on for a response. So that's current day. Now, I'm going to play a snippet of my father's testimony. You're going to hear his audio.
We came downstairs and the Canadian soldier said to my mother, he says, the button came off my pants. Can you sew it? And it was like a mitzvah. She was smiling and enjoying every moment of it, and she sewed the button out.
Yes, that is the favorite part of my father's testimony video. So based on that, here's how I imagined the scene playing out. And this is from page 256 in the book. It's April 1st, 1945. And my father, after 909 days of hiding in a barn attic, has just been liberated. My father, Walter, ventures out first. His mother and grandmother cautiously follow out of the attic and down the stairs. As they approach the kitchen, they hear the broken Dutch spoken by the Allied soldiers, with some English interspersed. Hilda's eyes fill with tears as she smiles broadly. The soldiers look at the thin, pale, frightened family entering the kitchen. This is a sight they would likely never forget as they look back and forth between Farmer Lansink and his refugees. One soldier reaches into his pocket. He looks at Hilda, cocks his head to the side, and pulls out a small item. He holds out the button to Hilda with an open hand, and with a kind voice, feigning surprise, he says, "The button came off my pants. Can you sew it back on for me?" Walter laughs and says, "It's like a mitzvah, the soldier, like he's performing a good deed for you, Mutti, with the button." Hilda sits on a chair, shaking and giddy, as she prepares to perform her first act in freedom. Someone hands her a needle and thread, and she begins to sew, to reattach a lost button, rejoining it with its rightful garment. And here's how I continued the Seder story that I started this with. 1 week after the Seder, I vowed to add a button to my Seder plate the following year as a symbol of my father's freedom. A button to represent the bitterness and the sweetness, the gratitude and the hope, all wrapped up in one small item that signifies my family's personal journey. I purchased on eBay a World War II Canadian soldier's uniform button to sit on my Seder plate, which I have. So let's try it. Think about an object that's always been important to you. And in your notes, I'd like you to describe the object. Just in a minute at the most. What does it look like? Does it have a smell? Does it make a sound? What does it feel like when you touch it, run your hands over it? What feelings does it elicit in you? And to add to that, describe how did you obtain the object? Who gave it to you? Or where did you find it? Or what were the circumstances that brought you to create it? So how did you obtain the object, and how did you feel in the moment you first saw it or touched it? And now, because we're not spending the whole workshop just on this one, you could do a whole hour, hour and a half just on this one writing activity. I realize that, but I'm just trying to give you some flavors of things that you can take away and work on yourselves or share. So the last question is really to get you to write a prompt for yourself if you do want to come back to writing more about this. And what I'm asking you to do is list a few key words that will help prompt you to write more about your object. Good. So I know you could keep going and keep writing. That's great. That's great. I'd like to debrief this a little bit and ask what kind of ahas you came away with. What's something maybe that you didn't realize before that you're starting to realize now that make you want to go and write more about your object? And feel free to unmute yourself. Was anybody surprised at whatever their object was, that what it elicited in you, Janice? Unmute yourself, please.
I was actually. I chose something that as a child I'd always been fascinated with, and they were arrowheads that my grandparents and father had picked up in the orange groves they used to own in Florida. And I had just always loved them for the historical and the fact that these were real artifacts, historical artifacts. And only now am I, with a 21st century mentality saying, and what about all the colonialism that is inherent in the fact that I, a white girl in Massachusetts, have these artifacts that should, by rights, have never come to me?
Mm,
And
wow,
what does that say about the family story? And how does that add a whole other dimension?
that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else want to share? Could you see using this as an activity in a classroom? I'm seeing a bunch of yeses. And does anybody feel like they would, and if I'm not going to be offended either way, but does anybody feel like they'd like to go away and write more about their own object? Some of you, yeah, okay, good, good. I hope you do, and that will be very exciting. Maybe you can share it with the group when you write an essay that becomes world famous or something. There were a couple of comments made about related to Seder. So there's one about using it for women's Seder activity, like what object would you put on the Seder plate and why might be the question. And Mara also mentioned that that was a good question to consider during Passover. So it is a good Passover question. And, you know, I just picked this one object because I happen to have that button. It was so important to me. It's a sweet moment to me that I realized the value of having this button as a memento, even though it's not the actual button that my Oma sewed back on. But what I realized as I was writing the book is there are actually a lot of objects and places that I kind of feel like are characters in my book. And I actually wrote a very short blog post, the link to which I just put in the chat, which is about the border crossing where my family crossed the border into Holland. Is a character. I'm questioning, can it be a character? And of course, I believe it can be and is a character. But there's more to it that I learned about that particular border crossing after I wrote the book that I'm reflecting on in this blog. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out. All right, let's move on. I want to share with you that I am not going to be talking about the accuracy and consistency of memory. We have an activity here that I knew we wouldn't have time for, so we're going to skip it. But you will be getting a handout from what we talked about today, the excerpts and the prompts. And I'm including this in that because I feel like it's so important. And the key questions I consider are, how important is it to confirm someone's memory when you're relying on that memory for something that is supposed to be factual? And how does memory change over time? So there's a lot about memory that can also be brought into story writing that I wanted to make sure I shared with you. So that will be in your handout. But now we're going to go to the section I'm calling Telling My Family's Story is Telling My Story, and Telling My Story is Telling My Family's Story. So I'd like to close my examples by sharing one of the many amazing moments that I experienced in my journey, unraveling my father's and my family's story. During that second trip to Germany in November 2018, I was invited to the home of a man named Josef Niebuhr, so he could interview me. Mr. Niebuhr, with an associate, had compiled this 500-page huge book of the history of the Jewish community of Bocholt, the town where my family had lived from 1900 to 1938. And it includes a page or two about each of the Jews of the town who were killed in the Holocaust. 175 biographies in all, including my grandfather and my great uncle. I'm going to read an excerpt from my book called Chapter 49, Testimony. I began with some background. My father, Walter Stern, gave his testimony in a video. From that video, I learned the story. Then I shared parts of the story. On Kristallnacht, my family was asleep, and at midnight, they heard a lot of noise, and I continued on the story. Somewhere in the middle of sharing my story, it hit me. I was giving testimony. I felt I was telling Oma's story on her behalf, with her hovering nearby, prompting me. Oma had never shared her story, any of the story, with me. It was the research and discovery I'd done that helped me uncover the details. It was painful and, for me, necessary. Was this part of the healing process? Something I had to do to mitigate the trauma I had inherited? I'm not sure, but it felt like I was continuing down the path that had been laid out for me, a path that revealed itself only a few steps at a time, rather than its entire trail map. I was journeying through something I needed to move through, not knowing what, if anything, lay at its terminus. For now, this travel through time and space was feeding my soul. Some of the soul food was bitter and made me wince in pain. At other times, it was sour and oddly enjoyable. Few parts were truly sweet. A few parts made me want more, notably the special relationships I was building along the way. the sweetness of those relationships, I hoped would endure for a long, long time. So that was kind of a culmination of how the stories for me intertwined. I was actually giving my Oma's testimony, something she had probably never done. And now I share my father's story, which is my story, which is my family's story, a story of the Jewish people, and truly a story of humanity in all types of settings, in churches and synagogues, universities and schools and libraries and senior communities. And each time I tell the story of humanity, it hits a nerve. And I've discovered this power of storytelling is so palpable wherever I go. There are many more family stories, these intergenerational stories in my book, and I invite you to use it for examples, if you would like, of imagining scenes, working with Jewish identity, or with the experience of generational trauma. So I would like to ask you, what is one thing, you need to think about this first, and then feel free to type it in chat or unmute yourself, so we'll have a minute to think about it. Post one thing that you plan to do in the next week based on or inspired by something we talked about today. Think about some gems that you've gathered and where you'd like to take them. So think about that for a minute, and then I'll ask you to share. Great. So I see interesting notes in the chat from just before, which is Susie. Thank you for posting this story, The Spoon She Carries, in the book by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried. And then there's a question Janice asks, can you heal someone else's trauma or just your share of it? I mean, that's a real great question. That could be a whole hour session talking about that. And can it heal your family in some way? I like to believe the answer to that is yes, but that's my own experience of it and my own struggle with it. But everybody will have their own experience. And Debbie Sosin writes that her mother self-published a book about her father's escape from Ukraine in 1913, including some of his own words, and she'll go back to it this week. So that's one specific action item that Deborah will take.
I see
Great.
Wacky's hand, Irene.
Yes, Wacky.
So I'm a little almost concerned about the emphasis on truth/facts. I think we can learn an enormous amount from things that we just believe. The Exodus story, how important is that to all of us as Jews? Maybe it didn't happen, we don't really know.
Yeah.
But the story is so compelling, and we identify so strongly with it as Jews that it doesn't really matter. I remember my first trip to Israel, we were at King David's tomb, and somebody yelled out, "Is he really in there?" And the tour guide said, "Does it matter? This is where we come to honor somebody that we believe was a great king in our history. And the honor is still there, whether there's a body in there or not."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I explore that a little bit in the book too, because I do struggle a little bit with accuracy, factual accuracy of things my father shares, right? Because he really greatly exaggerates some things. But in the end, I conclude that, does it really matter if it was, 30,000 people or 1,000 people? It does matter, but the truth with a capital T, right? The truth of the story, the learning that we get from the story is really what's important. And I think that's a similar point to what you're saying. So even though there is truth behind what he tells, and they're not completely accurate, I make the argument similar to what you just did, that there's still quite valuable and important as stories, and we learn a lot. We do learn a lot from them. So thank you for sharing that. Any other actions that people would like to take in the coming week, or questions that you have, or things that you want to bring up for discussion in our last few minutes together? So Andrea writes, and then we'll come to Robin. Andrea writes, exploring objects as symbols or characters more, trying out journaling to help process challenging events and situations herself with the students. That's great. You know, something about using objects is kind of more of a safe thing, right? Because you're not writing about a person, you're writing about the object. So that might be a very good entree for students to start writing about difficult kinds of things. Thank you. And Robin?
I've been thinking a lot about the question of telling my family's story versus telling my story. My mom died a few weeks ago, and so we've been telling a lot of stories, and not exactly arguments, but like, is that the story that mom would want to tell? And that's your story, but that's not mom's story, and that's my story. And like, whose stories are we actually telling as we memorialize? And the truth, like my brother and I have very different and my dad, some of us have very different memories.
Yeah.
And even around objects, like, no, she got that from so and so, was my family. You know, it's just really into sort of it hit home in a really beautiful way this morning. So thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry for your loss, Robin. And yeah, we all have different memories than the people closest to us about the same exact event. It took me a while to really understand that and learn it. I learned a lot of that through reading memoir, but also when I was trying to corroborate some of my memories with my brother, it didn't work out so well. He's like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you mean. So that's just natural. We all have our own frame. We sit in our seat looking at something, and everybody else is going to be sitting in a different seat. So thank you for bringing that up. And it does add a lot of shades, right? It's a lot of color to a story because you're hearing all these different perspectives.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments, ideas, questions? Great. So I am going to just put into the chat a few links. You can feel free, if you're interested in my book, there's a link to the book. You can follow the ongoing unraveling of the story because I keep finding out new stuff, which is rather incredible, on Facebook or through my periodic e-letter. And I do presentations. So if you're interested or you just want to talk more, feel free to reach out to me through my website. There's a contact page, or you probably will have my email address. I'll just put it in the chat also, so you'll have it.
Fantastic.
So
So
that is it for me.
Fantastic. As I hope everyone agrees that this was a riveting adventure story. And Irene, you know, obviously I've heard you tell this in different venues and different pieces of the story. And of course, I've read the book, so it deeply resonates because of what I'm beginning to know. But I think even whatever little bit you know coming into this Zoom, you are participants this morning, there's so many layers that touch us so deeply. And one of the reasons, of course, that I brought Irene is I think that her memoir brings us a new kind of approach to how we bring Holocaust and Holocaust stories to ourselves and to our students. And I think all of us, I'm sure, are challenged every year, and it gets harder and harder every year, of how do we keep the memories of the Holocaust alive for our students and not traumatize them and all the like. So Irene, I really, really, really appreciate everything you brought to our group this morning. Thank you, Robin, for just putting the link to our feedback form. I would thank you for doing that while I'm saying this. We'd really, really appreciate if you could fill out the feedback form. Take a minute now. And there's some questions also that we will obviously share with Irene. And I strongly encourage, if you are moved by Irene's story and presentation, Those of us local to the greater Boston area, I'm sure Irene is more than happy to arrange for in-person presentations. And those of us further afield, she's obviously very adept at doing this kind of work on Zoom. Jerry, I do see your hand, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So this was really wonderful, and I definitely was thinking even before Marion said it about how to bring it into the classroom. And I think some of the storytelling prompts I try to do now with my 7th graders around when, especially during the Holocaust unit. But I really think that there's a lot here in terms of the way you presented it. So thank you. And I had to hop into the car on my way to my next appointment. And I'm wondering if you, Marion, could please put the links that were shared in the chat in an email to the participants, just so we could have access to those resources.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. When Deb shares out the recording, we will share the handout that Irene shared. And Irene, I guess, yeah, I'll figure out how to, yeah, we'll put her website, her shattered.
Actually, all of these links are at the end of the handout, so you'll have it in the handout.
Okay, so they're already there in the handout,
Yeah.
which we'll
Yes.
certainly share when
Yeah.
she shares the recording. All right. Jerry, are you raising your hand a second? Okay. Got it. So thank you all very much. I'm also feeling the blessing of a second Adar this year, since obviously there's still only, 10 months in our school year, but having this extra month to think about Yom HaShoah and obviously and for Pesach as well. I think, Irene, your story, your experiences, all of the foundational work that you've laid for us in thinking anew about this will have a lot of impact as many of us go into working with our students for Pesach and for Yom HaShoah, and certainly even for Purim coming up. So I want to wish everybody a good rest of the week. So lovely to be together and see so many of you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Irene. Really an amazing hour together as usual. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for
Thank
being.
you.
Thank you.
Great. Robin, you want to do your trick?
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you wanted to chat about anything or if we're all set.
Yeah, yeah.
I just
Great.
put everything back in the waiting room.
Yeah. So thank you. Just really thank you. Really thank you. Yeah, I hope
You're
you feel
welcome.
good. And Irene, I think like everything that you did to sort of shift and mold it to be more on target. Amazing, really amazing.
Oh, good. I was glad we talked because I just thought totally differently about it. So
Yep, really, really powerful, really.
thank you. I'll be very interested in seeing the evaluations because I would love to do this kind of session. Now that I've done it, I'm like, yeah, I like doing this. And I would love feedback to see what I should change up.
No, and I loved, the button was a great example. Just really, and just even the scaffolding of the prompts was really, really beautiful. And I mean, I'll share with the three of you. Oh, actually, I should stop recording.